culture and language, we can't separate them. As soon as you open your mouth and say, hi, there is culture. Different cultures do things differently. So you can't just translate hi to whatever potentially appropriate in another language. You have to learn the whole sequence of scenes. And Elena Jordan used to say, it's not language and culture, it's language in culture.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Mari Noda talks about the game of language learning and how each of us can endeavor to fail better in our interactions with other cultures.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are excited to speak with Dr. Mari Noda today. She recently gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on things to consider as we learn to participate in another culture.
You can find that video on our website.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Mari.
Thank you.
We are so excited to have you in the studio today with us. This is somewhat of a homecoming for you as an alum from Cornell here.
Absolutely. Yes.
So let's start out by having you briefly introduce yourself for our listeners and share with us your background and your own path with languages.
Oh, my goodness. That can go back quite a while. But let me just start from where I was at Cornell a few decades ago. I came in as an international student, and English was my second language. It still is. So not everything was smooth, but I felt that this was a really wonderful community of people who I had two roommates who really welcomed me. And orientation week was somewhat of an interesting thing. They had an orientation for international students.
Sure.
So I went, and I came back to my room, and my two roommates were very eager to hear what I thought about the whole experience. And I said, it was really nice. I met a very nice virgin, and they looked at me. And here is this innocent-looking Japanese girl. And they said, Mari, who did you meet? And I thought I made a mistake on my V and B, which, was a weakness for Japanese. So I really stressed my V.
Yeah.
So I met this very nice virgin. They looked more and more puzzled. Well, who I met was someone from Belgium.
Yes.
So that was my initiation to Cornell experience.
Thank you for sharing that story.
But anyway, language is contextualized.
Absolutely.
So in that mistake, there were multiple things going on, and it was a very believable mistake, right? So every time I talk about context and language, I kind of come back in my own head to that episode.
Oh, that is so funny. Are you still in touch with that lovely person from Belgium?
No. It was a one-day encounter.
But memorable, as it turned
there you go.
out.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, that is too funny. So tell us a little bit more about what you have been doing since that fateful day at orientation.
So I came in as an food and nutrition undergrad, and I was going to become a specialist on fat, lipid that had no calories. That was going to be my research. But in my sophomore year, my parents, who were in New York at the time, had to go back to Japan. So they called me one day and said, Mari, pack up. You're leaving in 1 month.
Oh, wow.
And I said, no, I'm not leaving in 1 month. At the least, I need to finish this academic year.
Sure.
So I started looking for a possibility of an income. And one of the things that I was always interested in was language. And I thought, okay, I can't teach English because everybody knows English around here. But perhaps I can teach Japanese. So I went over to the language department. Back then it was in Rand Hall. And I looked for a name that looked credible, and that there was a Professor Murasaki. So I went to see her. The secretary said, well, she's on sabbatical, but there is Professor Jordan, if you'd like to meet her. And I thought, Jordan. That doesn't sound like a credible name for Japanese, but okay, I'll meet her. And that really was the fateful meeting because she was the forerunner and a specialist on Japanese language pedagogy.
Was she Belgian? Sorry.
You just couldn't help it.
No, I couldn't. That story will always make me smile. So wonderful.
So, I met her, and later on, several years later, I found out that she had a little folder for me, and in it, she had a little piece of paper that said, free tutor, ? So that's how we met.
Nice. Where did it take you from there?
Well, so that semester, there was nothing for me to do. But she said, if you'd like to come to some classes to observe, you're welcome to do so, which I did. And then in the spring semester, there was a shortage of teachers. So she actually hired me as a TA, and I was a sophomore.
Wow.
Japanese was not something that many people took back then. So I walked into the classroom and saw my 5 students, and they were all older than I was, all male.
Oh,
They looked frightening. But that's how I started, and I got some training from Bob Sukul, who gave and took copious notes, and spent hours with me afterwards talking about what went wrong, what went right.
Yeah.
So I had a wonderful training, one-on-one training.
Yeah.
And that's how I started. And then I got more and more into it.
Yeah.
And eventually I decided to study linguistics and finished eventually and went on.
Yeah. Wonderful.
All right. Well, in your talk, you compared learning a language to playing a game, and that failures, especially when it comes to culture, are inevitable and frequent. So what is the role of culture in language learning, and how can we, as you put it, fail better?
Well, you want to listen to my other lectures? But anyway, I think the story that I started with is probably a nice failure, right? It was a phenomenal mistake. But I can laugh at it back now. It could have had worse consequences. But we all make mistakes. And the question is how we come up from it and how we learn from it. So going back to your first question about culture and language, we can't separate them. As soon as you open your mouth and say hi, there is culture. In some cultures, you don't say hi. You just smile and nod, or you make a stern face without saying anything for a few minutes. Different cultures do things differently. So you can't just translate hi to whatever potentially appropriate in another language. You have to learn the whole sequence of scenes. So that's how I view culture and language. And Alana Jordan used to say, it's not culture and language and culture, it's language in culture. And there's real truth to that. You really can't separate them.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked a lot about the pedagogical materials, their effectiveness, and how important they are, especially when you think about how we can encourage our students to participate in different cultures and learn that. So can you recap for us, what do effective materials actually look like?
Wow. I'd like to say when we choose materials, we are also biased by our own upbringings about what we learn from. So we tend to look at textbooks. We tend to go through the pages and see what's there. But really, if you're trying to learn a language, you can't avoid the noise, the sound, and how people move. So good materials, and in this day of technology and media accessibility, you have no excuse for not including the multimedia component to the materials. So any textbooks that don't have these other things, like at least the audio, if not audio and video, I become very skeptical. So that's the first thing I would look at. And then, of course, the content. You want to have not just a list of stuff,
Sure.
but integrated things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can those materials help improve students' level of performance in what you refer to as the language game? So what's the role? You shared some examples of videos from a Japanese textbook. What do those materials really do for the learners? How are they effective?
Materials, as I said, select things for the learners to work on, but they're just samples. So if learners approach language learning with materials thinking that that's all they have to master, of course, that's misleading. It's only a small segment of the culture that they're going to be active in. But even if it's a small sample, one little sample should also enrich one's life in a immeasurable way. So materials where there's a lot of wasted components
Sure.
are not all that useful.
Yeah.
But if you can do one little segment of the material and still do a lot in the language with people who don't know what you studied with,
Yeah.
that would be really valuable, wouldn't it?
So, in your own teaching experience, how do students react to these materials?
You know, I find that students are very humble. They put a lot of trust in the materials because that's what they're going to spend the most time with. Their teachers are not going to walk around with them on campus all day long, but they can do that with the materials. So if they befriend their materials,
True. Yeah.
they can get so much out of it. And good students know how to do that. They don't put away the material until 3 minutes before class. They kind of really dive into it. And students who do that tend to do better.
So what is your thought about students learning language, culture, the combination, without ever being immersed in the target culture? Is it possible for students to become proficient in either or both without having the opportunity to actually being there? And maybe have you seen differences in, in your years of teaching? You just mentioned media and, how things have changed in that regard. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think the being there, the study abroad opportunity is incredibly valuable. I can't deny that at all. But for each student, there's the good time to do that.
Sure.
And better time to do that. And the better time, I would say, is after they have had some introduction and to how they can use the language and what they can watch out for
Yeah.
in the culture when they get there. I talked about this one student, Steve,
Yeah.
who was very successful, even though he had no Japanese going to Japan at first. But he's a special case. He was able to control things around him in ways that many students cannot do. So if not just the basic level of language, at least the basic level of strategies for learning. If we can send students with that to the target community, I think that would be really, really good.
So talking about a student like Steve, who you said is a good at playing the language game, maybe unusually so, when you ask that question, what is your game as far as language goes? When we study language, the game isn't clear, and even less clear is how you win the game. So we don't know how to score until someone shows us. There's no rule book. Can you unpack that for us some more?
I wish I could.
The Holy Grail right there.
In 2 minutes?
Take all the time you need.
Yeah, your life's work right there.
Observing, and absorbing, and then trial and error. A lot of trial and error. But that's where the pedagogical materials become useful. They give you some elements that you can use for your trial. They can prevent certain faux pas.
Sure.
So, and they are very encouraging in terms of what you can do. So take it from there and really not be afraid to make the mistake, but be sensitive to other people's reactions so that when you do make mistakes, you gain from them, that you reflect, you have the ability to reflect on what you've done and think about it. Yesterday I was visiting the first-year Japanese class, and one of the students asked me, at the recent interview test, I said this, and I think I got my points taken off. Is that really bad? And I felt like saying, hallelujah to you for thinking about that. He didn't just throw away the score sheet. He thought about it, and he came to identify this one little phrase that he used, which was grammatically fine. But it didn't work as well as he had wanted his utterance to work. And it's that small thing. And the better you are at coming up with perfectly grammatical sentences, the worse it is when you make the mistake, because people think that you were intentional, that it wasn't a mistake. So this is sidetracking. This is an argument someone made when we were talking about pronunciation. They said, well, if you sound perfectly good as if you were a native speaker, and if you make pragmatic error, then people think that you were serious, that you
interesting, yeah.
didn't make the mistake because you were not used to the language. And isn't that bad? That's a legitimate question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and we had a case who he was on an internship in China, and his Chinese was really good,
Yeah.
but he didn't know how to use humor. Humor is difficult,
Oh, yeah.
right? So he was using all the American humor with Chinese, and that was bad.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
His
Fascinating.
he was thrown out of more companies than you can imagine in the internship program, and the program was having to find another place for him
Yeah.
every 3 weeks because Chinese people just didn't like this.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and they thought that he was the bad guy
Yeah.
when he was well intended. So the better you are at the linguistic code level, when it doesn't match with your pragmatics,
Yeah.
this is a bad combination.
Yeah. Yeah. So failing is good in many regards, but sometimes failing like that is
Is
dangerous.
that is
for
dangerous?
your
Yes.
for your
Yeah,
professional
yeah.
career. Interesting. One thing I think about quite frequently. I haven't lived in Germany for a very long time, and sometimes I wonder if other colleagues who are teaching language are in a similar situation. How can you actually accurately portray current language use, current cultural phenomena? Because, I mean, German culture for me kind of fossilized over 20 years ago, right? How do you, and certainly pedagogical materials help with that, but how can you overcome that as an educator? Or what are some strategies where you can make sure that, students don't end up sounding like, German from 50 years ago?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, it's a lot easier today because of the media, the internet. I can keep track of the news, a lot of the TV programs, and of course, certainly YouTube, to see how people use language to interact with each other, what sort of things are being used, what sort of things become dead. And it is really astonishing, even in the culture that you're being surrounded by, even today. Let me give you an example. The other day, I had a large event last week, and a local paper wrote up about it. And so somebody found the article online and sent it around. And I thought, oh, that's really nice. So I went to the supermarket and got the real newspaper, the paper newspaper, right? And I took a picture and sent it to some of the other organizers. And the one person went out right away to get herself a copy as well. I think she went to either Walgreens or some other pharmacy and asked, where do they have newspaper? And the response she got was, "What's that?"
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
And at
Thanks.
first,
Now I feel ancient.
right?
Yeah.
So she didn't comprehend this at first, and she said, "The newspaper, newspaper, today's newspaper," and she still got, "What's that?" So times are changing all around us.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to keep track of something like that without experiencing. But trying to keep up with the media at least with a lot. I do watch a lot of drama and news. I watch the Japanese news every day, just to see just to follow on the topics and the way people talk about things. Yeah.
So, going back to pedagogical materials such as videos or even newspapers, can language educators use the same materials for different proficiency levels? And how would they need to adapt them to make them relevant for different learners?
Oh, that's an interesting question. If you go off pedagogical materials, you have to do that, right? If you use, like, let's say, a little clip from a movie, that's not a pedagogical materials, but you could use it for pedagogical purposes. And what you do with it would be different. What we have to watch out for is if you take a clip from a movie and say, who is this? If that's something that you would actually do with that clip, and oftentimes it is, so that's legitimate. But if the movie portrays a Tokyo station that most people would recognize right away if they were in Japan, and say, what kind of place is this? Just to practice the word, the train station. That is a little strange to me. So what you do with the pedagogical materials, you can change it depending on the level of the students, but at all times you also have to be mindful as to is this an okay question within the culture? Is this purely pedagogical, or is this only to elicit the word train station?
Yeah.
Or is this a question that people would ask? That's the kind of question I always have when I use materials, whether it's pedagogical materials or not. Same media that comes with the pedagogical materials. The way I used it yesterday in my talk, where you would look at a little piece of dialogue and go really deep into where is this, who are these people, what roles they're playing, where's the audience. That's a little advanced.
Sure.
To do it in the target language. You can do it in the base language of the learners at the beginning level. At the advanced level, you can have the same discussion in the target language. And that's an exercise I call performance watch. And I do it with graduate students all the time. But to do that in the target language would be an interesting exercise for the advanced level.
Great. Well, Mari, there is so much more that we could talk about, but can we direct our listeners to online resources where they can find out more about you and your work?
Online resources. Well, I did produce, along with a few other co-authors, a new beginning to intermediate level Japanese. And there's a website for that. It's at Brigham Young University, and it's called Nihongo Now. So if anybody went to nihongonao.byu.edu, you'll find a array of interesting things, including a web video that was produced on location in Tokyo with a professional director and sound mixer and actors that depicts one of the scenes from each chapter of the first volume, 12 episodes, that are pretty fun to watch.
Nice.
It comes with a lot of music and movements and a lot of cultural introductions. So
Great.
So before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share a word in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn, that doesn't exist in English, but you wish it did. What word comes to mind for you?
You know, you gave me that homework yesterday. And just about every word I can think of in Japanese, I like that. But I'm going to select this word. It's yappari. Yappari. And beginning level learners know this word, but it's interesting that it's if I had to kind of translate it into English, it's a word that you use to indicate that this is an observation of an outcome after some thinking or debating or all things that could have happened. That's the end product. That's how it's rather complicated. So let me give you a few examples. All right. So you're a high school student and you have applied to many schools, and all of the schools look really attractive. One place gives you good scholarship, another place is located in the ideal location. So you have a really hard time choosing, and in the end, yappari, I'm coming to Cornell. So this
Nice.
is after long, hard thinking. After all, well, okay, this is it. That's when you use it. Another place, you're planning as hiking, and you're really worried about the weather, and you really want to go, but it may snow, it may rain, it may be cloudy, and in the morning you wake up, yappari, it's snowing. So there, you're not really talking about the result of a long thinking process, but when it's all said and done,
Yeah.
that's the end result. But it's used in many situations,
Yeah.
and it's used often.
Yeah. I like that. That's a good one. Well, Mari, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Next week, we will speak with two of Cornell's 2025 college scholars about their exciting projects regarding responses to alienation across cultures and about the role of language in the application of the rule of law around the world. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.